The Bible never describes Jesus' physical appearance. No height, no skin, no hair texture, no facial features. That silence is not accidental, and it changed the course of history. For over 2,000 years, billions of people have prayed to a face they believe represents Jesus Christ. That face appears in paintings, statues, films, churches, and homes across the world. Yet here is the uncomfortable truth. The image most people recognize today was not recorded by eyewitnesses, not preserved by Scripture, and not passed down from the first followers of Jesus. Instead, it was created later, shaped by art, power, culture, and politics. When the Bible chose to focus on Jesus' words and actions rather than his appearance, it left behind a blank canvas, and blank spaces rarely stay empty. Over centuries, empires, institutions, and societies filled that silence with images that reflected their own ideals, values, and authority. What began as faith slowly intertwined with influence. What started as belief gradually became identity. And eventually, an image meant to inspire love and humility became a symbol loaded with power. Why does this matter today? Because images shape how we think. They shape how we worship. And they shape how entire civilizations understand truth, race, and belonging. When a single image is repeated for generations, it stops being questioned and starts being accepted as fact. In this video, we are going to open history's locked vaults and ask a simple but powerful question. What if the image you have always known was never the original truth? Stay with us as we trace how Jesus' image was formed, transformed, and used across centuries from ancient empires to modern media. This is not about attacking faith. It is about understanding history. If you value truth, context, and stories that challenge what we think we already know, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because some truths were hidden for a reason, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. Jesus did not step into history as a figure floating outside of place, time, or people. He was born into a specific world, shaped by a specific land, and marked by a specific history. To understand who he was, we must first understand where he came from. First-century Palestine was not a distant European landscape of marble cathedrals and pale frescoes, but a rugged, sun-soaked region under Roman occupation, where daily life was defined by heat, labor, and survival. This was the environment that formed Jesus from birth. Long before his message would travel beyond its borders and be transformed by cultures far removed from its origins. Jesus was Jewish, born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth, both located in the ancient region of Judea. This area sat at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean world, populated by Semitic peoples whose physical characteristics were shaped by centuries of climate, geography, and ancestry. The men and women of this region were farmers, builders, fishermen, and traders, spending much of their lives outdoors under an unforgiving sun. Their skin tones were naturally darker, their hair typically dark and curly, and their features consistent with what we would today recognize as Middle Eastern. These were not exceptions. They were the norm. Historical anthropology supports this reality. Skeletal remains from the region, combined with textual records and genetic studies of long-established Jewish communities, paint a clear picture of the average Judean male in the 1st century. He was shorter than modern European standards, physically strong from manual labor, and marked by features that reflected Semitic ancestry rather than Greco-Roman ideals. Jesus would not have stood out in a crowd because of how he looked. On the contrary, he would have blended seamlessly among his peers, indistinguishable from other Jewish men who shared the same heritage, customs, and daily struggles. This understanding aligns with the way Jesus lived. He walked long distances across villages and hills, worked with his hands, and moved freely among ordinary people. Nothing in the historical record suggests a figure whose appearance drew special attention. His impact came from his words, his actions, and the radical nature of his teachings, not from any physical distinction. In fact, the lack of description in early texts may itself be telling. Those who followed him were not concerned with preserving his face. They were consumed by preserving his message. Yet as the story of Jesus traveled beyond Palestine and into the heart of the Roman world, distance began to reshape memory. Communities far removed from Judea began to imagine him through familiar lenses, gradually replacing historical reality with cultural reflection. Over time, the Jewish man from a Middle Eastern province became increasingly disconnected from his origins. Not because evidence changed, but because perspective did. The farther Jesus moved from his homeland, the more his image began to resemble those who told his story. Recognizing Jesus as a Jewish man of first-century Palestine does not diminish his significance. It deepens it. It places him firmly within the struggles of an occupied people, living under imperial rule, speaking to communities who understood poverty, injustice, and hope firsthand. His message gains weight when we see him not as a distant, idealized figure shaped by later aesthetics, but as a man grounded in a real historical world, navigating real human condition. This historical grounding restores coherence to the story we have been unfolding. The blank canvas left by Scripture did not exist because appearance was unimportant, but because the truth of who Jesus was did not depend on it. When later generations filled that silence with images that reflected themselves, something essential was lost along the way. To look back toward Jesus' Middle Eastern roots is not to rewrite faith, but to reconnect it with the reality from which it first emerged, reminding us that his story began not in the halls of power, but among ordinary people in a land far older and far more complex than the images that would come centuries later. In the earliest years after Jesus' death, his followers did not attempt to preserve his face. There were no portraits passed from hand to hand, no official likeness guarded by the community, and no concern with fixing his appearance in paint or stone. This absence was not a failure of memory, but a deliberate reflection of how early Christians understood their faith. What mattered to them was not what Jesus looked like, but what he taught, how he lived, and what his life meant in a world shaped by fear, power, and survival. These early believers lived under constant pressure. Christianity was not a recognized religion but a fragile movement viewed with suspicion by Roman authorities. Public displays of devotion could bring persecution, imprisonment, or death. In such a climate, images were dangerous, not sacred. Visual representations could expose communities, invite accusation, or be mistaken for idolatry in a religious culture deeply shaped by Jewish traditions that discouraged the creation of sacred images. For followers raised within that tradition, avoiding physical depictions was both practical and theological. Instead of faces, early Christians turned to symbols. Simple, quiet, and easily concealed. These symbols carried layers of meaning without drawing unwanted attention. The fish, known as the ichthys, became one of the earliest and most powerful signs of belief. To outsiders, it was nothing more than a common mark scratched into stone or sand. To believers, it held a coded confession of faith, a reminder of Jesus' teachings, and a shared identity that could be recognized without words. The symbol did not define Jesus' appearance. It defined his message. Another image that quietly circulated was that of the Good Shepherd. Rather than presenting Jesus as a ruler, a king, or a divine figure set apart from humanity, this symbol showed him as a guide, protector, and caretaker. The shepherd was a familiar figure in everyday life, someone associated with patience, humility, and responsibility. By using this image, Early Christians emphasized relationship over authority and compassion over power. Jesus was not elevated above the human experience through idealized form. He was brought closer to it through meaning. Even when artistic representations began to appear in places like the Roman catacombs, they remained intentionally vague. These early images did not aim to record a historical likeness. Faces were youthful, generic, and symbolic, shaped more by spiritual intention than physical accuracy. The goal was not recognition, but reflection. These images invited believers to contemplate who Jesus was to them, not what he looked like to the world. This approach reveals something essential about early Christianity. The movement grew through shared belief, lived example, and oral tradition rather than visual authority. Faith was transmitted through stories, teachings, and communal memory, not through standardized imagery. In this context, preserving a physical likeness may have even felt unnecessary or distracting. To fix Jesus' face too clearly might have risked limiting his meaning, turning a universal message into a confined image. As the faith slowly spread beyond its Jewish roots and into diverse cultures, this symbolic foundation allowed Christianity to adapt without losing its core. People from different backgrounds could see themselves within the message because it was not anchored to a single physical form. The absence of a defined appearance made Jesus accessible rather than exclusive, understood through values rather than visuals. This period of symbolic restraint stands in sharp contrast to what would come later, when power, politics, and empire would begin to demand clearer images, stronger authority, and recognizable faces. But in the beginning, before institutions and influence reshaped the story, early Christians chose meaning over image and spirit over form. Their silence on Jesus' appearance was not an oversight. It was a reflection of a faith centered on transformation from within, long before history would attempt to transform his image from the outside. The shift began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as Christianity moved from the margins of society into the center of imperial power. For centuries, the faith had survived in secrecy, carried by symbols and whispered teachings rather than public authority. But when the Roman Empire officially embraced Christianity in the early 4th century, everything changed. What had once been a movement of the persecuted now found itself aligned with the most powerful political structure in the known world. With that alignment came a new challenge: how to present this faith in a way that felt familiar, credible, and commanding to a vast and diverse empire. Rome understood images. The empire had long used art, sculpture, and architecture to communicate authority and unity across its territories. Emperors were carved in marble, gods were idealized in statues, and power was reinforced through visual language as much as law. When Christianity entered this world, it did not remain untouched by these traditions. The symbolic restraint of early believers began to give way to a more visible, structured, and recognizable portrayal of Jesus, one that could stand alongside the visual culture of Rome rather than exist in opposition to it. Early Roman depictions of Jesus reflected this shift. In catacombs and mosaics, he began to appear not as a distinctly Middle Eastern Jewish man, but as a figure shaped by Roman aesthetic norms. His hair grew shorter and neater, his face more youthful and composed, his clothing resembling that of Roman citizens rather than rural Judean workers. These were not random artistic choices. They were deliberate adaptations designed to make Jesus intelligible within a Roman worldview, presenting him as a figure who belonged in the empire rather than one who stood apart from it. The image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd took on new meaning during this period. While it retained its symbolic roots, it was increasingly rendered through Roman artistic conventions, portraying calm authority rather than humble care. The shepherd became a figure of order and leadership, echoing the way Roman rulers wished to be seen by their subjects. Through such images, Jesus was subtly repositioned, no longer only a spiritual guide, but a figure whose presence could support stability, hierarchy, and imperial unity. As Christianity spread under imperial protection, these images multiplied and circulated widely. Churches commissioned artwork, public spaces displayed mosaics, and the once abstract figure of Jesus began to acquire a consistent visual identity. This identity did not reflect historical accuracy. It reflected political necessity. A religion that now served millions across vast territories needed an image that could unify rather than divide, one that felt authoritative without feeling foreign. Roman features accomplished this task, offering a familiar face through which imperial subjects could approach a new faith without abandoning their cultural framework. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor was it the result of a single decree. It emerged gradually as artists, patrons, and church leaders navigated the intersection of belief and power. Over time, the Romanized image of Jesus began to feel natural, even inevitable, to those living within the empire. The distance between historical reality and visual representation widened, not because truth was unknown, but because relatability and authority were prioritized over origin. What is striking is how effectively this shift set a precedent for the centuries that followed. Once Jesus had been visually reshaped to reflect imperial Rome, future societies would feel justified in continuing the process, adapting his image to mirror their own ideals and structures of power. The Roman Empire did not erase Jesus' origins, but it reframed them, embedding the faith within its own image and values. This moment marks a turning point in the story. The faith that began without a face now had one, and that face carried the imprint of empire. From this point forward, Jesus would increasingly be seen not only through the lens of his teachings, but through the visual language of those who held authority. The transformation was subtle, strategic, and enduring, laying the foundation for an image that would travel far beyond Rome, shaped by power long after the empire itself had fallen. As the Roman Empire faded and Europe entered the medieval era, Christianity did not lose its influence. It inherited it. The structures of imperial authority dissolved, but the church remained, filling the vacuum left behind. With this transition came a profound shift in how Jesus was imagined, understood, and presented to the world. The Romanized image that had once served an empire now began to evolve again, shaped by a Europe that was redefining itself through faith, territory, and power. Medieval Europe was not a unified world, but a collection of kingdoms bound together by a shared religious identity. Christianity became the common language that connected distant regions, and the church stood as the most powerful institution of the age. Art, architecture, and ritual were not merely expressions of belief. They were tools of authority. Cathedrals towered over cities, manuscripts shaped knowledge, and images taught theology to populations who could not read. In this visual environment, Jesus was no longer an abstract spiritual guide, but the central figure through which order, morality, and hierarchy were communicated. Gradually, Jesus' appearance began to reflect the people who worshipped him. Artists portrayed him with lighter skin, softer features, and hair that mirrored European norms. These depictions were not intended to mislead. They were designed to make Jesus familiar and emotionally accessible. For medieval believers who had never encountered the peoples or landscapes of the Middle East, a European-looking Jesus felt natural, even reassuring. Faith was most powerful when it felt close, and familiarity bred devotion. The rise of the Crusades in the 11th century intensified this transformation. Religion and warfare became deeply entangled, and Jesus' image took on new significance as a symbol of divine legitimacy. European armies marched under banners bearing his likeness, believing themselves to be defenders of a sacred cause. In this context, portraying Jesus as European reinforced the idea that God's favor rested with Christendom. The image was no longer only about devotion, it was about identity, belonging, and moral authority in a world defined by conflict. Medieval artists responded to these shifts by giving Jesus a commanding presence. He was depicted as a ruler, enthroned and authoritative, often with stern expressions that emphasized judgment as much as mercy. Icons like Christ Pantocrator presented him as an all-seeing sovereign, a figure who mirrored the centralized power of the Church itself. These images taught believers how to see God, and in doing so, they also taught them how to see power. Jesus became a visual anchor for a worldview in which spiritual and political authority were deeply intertwined. Because Europe during this period was largely isolated from the regions of Jesus' historical origins, there was little reason to question these representations. For most believers, art was their primary source of theological understanding. What they saw in churches and manuscripts became truth by repetition. Over generations, the European image of Jesus solidified, not through debate or evidence, but through familiarity and institutional reinforcement. This era marked a critical stage in the transformation of Jesus' image. The Roman influence that once shaped his portrayal gave way to a distinctly European identity, one that aligned seamlessly with medieval values and power structures. The Jewish man from first-century Palestine was now visually distant, replaced by a figure who embodied the spiritual authority of Europe itself. The change did not erase faith, but it redirected it, anchoring belief to a face that reflected dominance rather than origin. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Europeanized Jesus was no longer a variation. He was becoming the standard, the image carried forward into future centuries, ready to be refined, idealized, and exported as Europe's influence expanded. What had begun as adaptation had become tradition, and tradition would soon be defended as truth. By the time Europe entered the Renaissance, the image of Jesus had already traveled far from its origins, shaped first by empire and then by medieval authority. What the Renaissance did was not to introduce a new direction, but to perfect an existing one. This period, celebrated as an age of rebirth and enlightenment, brought with it a renewed obsession with beauty, proportion, and the ideal human form. Art was no longer meant only to instruct or inspire devotion. It was meant to embody perfection. And in this pursuit of perfection, the image of Jesus was refined into a form that would become definitive for centuries to come. Renaissance artists turned to classical Greek and Roman ideals as their standard of beauty. The human body was studied, measured, and idealized, with symmetry and harmony elevated as expressions of truth itself. Within this artistic framework, Jesus was no longer simply a spiritual figure or a symbol of authority. He became the ultimate representation of divine humanity, depicted through features that reflected European norms of attractiveness and grace. Light skin, straight or gently flowing hair, and serene facial expressions became central to his portrayal, not because they reflected historical reality, but because they aligned with the artistic language of the time. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo did not invent the European Jesus, but their mastery ensured its permanence. Leonardo's Last Supper placed Jesus at the emotional and visual center of the scene. Calm and composed, his appearance carefully balanced and unmistakably European. Michelangelo's work in the Sistine Chapel reinforced this vision through monumental scale and idealized form, presenting sacred figures with physical perfection drawn from classical sculpture. These images were powerful not only because of their beauty, but because of their authority. Created under the patronage of the Church and displayed in sacred spaces, they carried an implicit claim to truth. The Church's role during the Renaissance was critical. As one of the greatest patrons of art, it guided what was created and how it was seen. By commissioning works that reflected European ideals, the Church effectively endorsed a specific image of Jesus, one that merged divine significance with cultural identity. This was not merely aesthetic preference. It was a visual theology that aligned holiness with European form. Over time, repetition transformed preference into expectation, and expectation into belief. This period also coincided with Europe's expanding sense of self. As exploration, trade, and conquest accelerated, Europeans increasingly viewed their culture as the standard by which others were measured. The Renaissance image of Jesus traveled with this mindset, reinforcing the idea that European appearance and values were closer to the divine ideal. The more these images spread, the more they replaced earlier, more ambiguous representations. The question of what Jesus looked like faded behind the certainty of what he was now shown to be. What made the Renaissance transformation so enduring was its emotional impact. These depictions invited viewers to see Jesus not as distant or unfamiliar, but as intimate and approachable within a European context. Art bridged the gap between the sacred and the everyday, and in doing so, it made the Europeanized Jesus feel authentic. Beauty became a substitute for accuracy, and familiarity took precedence over origin. By the end of the Renaissance, the image of Jesus as a white European man was no longer simply one interpretation among many. It had become the dominant visual narrative, reinforced by artistic brilliance, institutional authority, and cultural confidence. This was the moment when the transformation reached its final form, ready to be carried forward into a global age. Long after the artists themselves were gone, their vision endured, shaping how millions would imagine Jesus, often without ever realizing that what they saw was not history, but a reflection of Europe looking back at itself. As European empires began to stretch their reach across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, the image of Jesus did not travel as a neutral spiritual symbol, but as part of a broader cultural package shaped by power, authority, and worldview. By the time colonial expansion accelerated from the 15th century onward, the European version of Jesus was already firmly established through medieval tradition and Renaissance art. This was the Jesus missionaries carried with them, not only in sermons and scriptures, but in paintings, statues, illustrated Bibles, and later printed images. For many contacted societies, this visual representation became their first and most lasting impression of Christianity, embedding a distinctly European face into a faith that had originated far from Europe itself. Missionaries often believed that familiar imagery would make conversion easier, and so Jesus was presented in forms that reflected the colonizers rather than the colonized. Churches built in distant lands were filled with images of a pale-skinned Christ, dressed in robes influenced by European artistic traditions, his features calm, refined, and unmistakably Western. Over time, these depictions became normalized, not because they reflected historical accuracy, but because they were repeated so consistently that alternatives were rarely seen. For local populations, the image of Jesus gradually merged with the image of European authority, subtly reinforcing the idea that spiritual truth, cultural power, and political dominance all flowed from the same source. As colonial societies evolved, art and education played a powerful role in solidifying this image. Religious schools taught children using European illustrations, while churches displayed imported artworks or locally produced copies modeled on European originals. Even when indigenous artists contributed, they were often trained within European frameworks that shaped how sacred figures were imagined. The result was a global visual language of Christianity that looked remarkably similar from continent to continent, despite vast differences in culture, history, and appearance among believers. In the modern era, mass media amplified this effect on an unprecedented scale. Early films about the life of Jesus, produced primarily in Europe and the United States, cast white actors in leading roles, drawing directly from the established artistic tradition. These films reached audiences far beyond church walls, embedding the white European Jesus into popular culture. Later, television broadcasts, illustrated children's books, magazines, and eventually digital media repeated the same imagery, reinforcing it through sheer volume and familiarity. Each generation inherited not only the story of Jesus, but a visual template that felt authoritative simply because it had always been there. The internet age did not initially disrupt this pattern. Early on, content largely recycled existing images, spreading them faster and farther than ever before. Search results. Educational resources and digital artwork continued to reflect the dominant European portrayal, often without questioning its origins. For many believers around the world, this image became inseparable from their personal faith, even if it bore little resemblance to the historical setting of first-century Palestine. Yet beneath this continuity lies an important tension. The global spread of the white European Jesus was not the result of historical discovery, but of historical circumstance. It followed trade routes, colonial borders, printing presses, film studios, and media networks controlled by Europe and its cultural descendants. The image endured not because it was more accurate, but because it was more powerful, backed by institutions that shaped education, art, and belief on a global scale. Understanding this process does not diminish the spiritual significance of Jesus for millions of people. Instead, it reveals how deeply faith can be influenced by history, culture, and technology. The modern conversation around Jesus' image is not about rejecting belief, but about recognizing how visual traditions were formed, transmitted, and preserved. As access to historical research, archaeology, and diverse perspectives expands, the story of Jesus' image continues to evolve, inviting believers and historians alike to reflect on the difference between the message of the faith and the images that have carried it across centuries and continents. In recent decades, modern scholarship and science have begun to quietly but firmly challenge the long-standing image of Jesus shaped by centuries of European tradition. Archaeology, historical texts, and forensic anthropology now work together to reconstruct a picture rooted not in ideology or empire, but in evidence. Researchers studying first-century Judea describe a region populated by Semitic peoples whose physical traits were shaped by the climate, geography, and genetic history of the Middle East. When forensic specialists use skulls from the same time and place to model facial features, the results consistently point toward darker skin, dark hair, and facial structures common to the Eastern Mediterranean, not Northern Europe. This emerging portrait does not come from a desire to provoke, but from a commitment to historical accuracy. These findings also invite deeper reflection on why the earlier image mattered so much. The Europeanized portrayal of Jesus did not exist in a vacuum. It carried social and cultural consequences. For centuries, linking holiness, authority, and moral purity to a white, Western appearance subtly reinforced racial hierarchies, especially during the colonial era and its aftermath. In many parts of the world, this visual tradition shaped how people understood power, identity, and even their own place within the Christian story. Modern scholars argue that correcting the image is not about replacing one bias with another, but about separating faith from historical distortion. Anthropologists and historians emphasize that acknowledging Jesus as a Middle Eastern Jewish man restores him to his real cultural and historical context. It places his teachings back among the oppressed, the colonized, and the marginalized of the Roman world, rather than aligning him with imperial dominance. This shift helps modern audiences better understand why his message resonated so strongly among ordinary people living under occupation and social inequality. When Jesus is seen as someone who physically belonged to that world, his teachings about justice, compassion, and humility take on renewed depth and relevance. Importantly, modern scholarship does not seek to strip Jesus of spiritual meaning. Instead, it challenges the idea that faith must be tied to a single cultural image. Around the world today, Christians increasingly depict Jesus in ways that reflect their own histories and communities, not as an act of defiance, but as a recognition that faith transcends race and geography. Science and history provide tools to correct the past, while belief continues to shape meaning in the present. As this story comes to a close, the goal is not to tell anyone what to believe, but to invite reflection. Images have power, especially when repeated across centuries. But they are not immutable. By understanding how Jesus' image was shaped, reshaped, and sometimes distorted, we gain a clearer view of both history and ourselves. Thank you for listening and for taking this journey through time, art, power, and truth. If you found this exploration meaningful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel to support more thoughtful stories like this in the future.